try that again. Good evening. Much better, much better. We have a long list of people on the sick list, and there's going to be, I think tomorrow is going to be a week long with everything that's taking place. Brother Moody is having cataract surgery tomorrow. Andrea has a urology specialist appointment she's been waiting on for 10 weeks. Holly is having back surgery, and this one's going to be pretty extensive. Terry is going to have a bronchoscopy. If you don't know what that is, he's got double pneumonia. It's a really severe case, and they'll probably wind up scoping both lungs and taking some samples to see if they can't figure out what's going on and the best course of treatment for him. Seems like there was another one or two, but nothing else tomorrow. But Brother Glenn is in pretty rough shape. He had 4 stents in the one artery. Another one's completely collapsed, and another one's deteriorated in, I think, 4 spaces, wasn't it, Brother Cox? 4 spaces. Sister Dot is getting over her last radiation treatment. Just a whole bunch of people out. We need to keep all of those in our thoughts and prayers. So, is there anybody that I've missed I seem to have given you the more critical ones tonight. Is there anybody I've missed on the sick and injured list that we need to pray for? I'm sorry? Glenn is home, but he sounds kind of strong, but I think he's got a ways to go yet. Charles he has to be on oxygen now, and the small battery packs won't do. If he gets out of the house, he's got to carry one of the big bottles around with him. So he's having a tough time on that. Tina's right now she's having more good days than bads, but she's just not really doing all that great. Of course, Glenda is still healing from her femur fracture, and she still won't admit how she did it. So, and last I heard, baby Owen was still coming along fine. And for those of you that missed it Sunday night, Aaron Carden, that visited with us Sunday night and is with us again tonight, he is in the delayed enlistment program, and he will be a full-fledged Marine the 11th of September, I think you said was your go date? Okay. So let's keep that family in our prayers, because Marine basic training is not that easy. But if he keeps his mouth shut and his ears open, then he'll be fine. Oh, okay. Back in school, and now everything going around, she's going to get at least once. Okay. Like I said, our list of sick are long. Oh, okay. Yeah, Kim Clonch, her uncle, passed away. That was Terry Holland. We announced that, but the funeral is going to be this Friday, so a couple of days from now. Brother Jeremy, would you lead us in a prayer before we start our class in?
We bow, Father, we come before you this evening. Thank you for time to come together, family, and study your word. Father, so many of our number are being so many different things. Father, be with each and every one of us, old and small. Be your will that we can help you in that do it all those that provide care. Father, what you've given us, don't see a lot of the blessings, but all of it. Things that we see that Father, you are here for visiting. Father, be with us in this congregation. Help us to out to those who comfort one another, that we live our daily life. Our testimony to all of Christ. May it always be possible to do this whole day. In His name we pray.
Amen. Matthew chapter 27. Sunday we had gone through and covered basically Christ's betrayal and how that Caiaphas had broken almost all the laws. Instead of being the judge, he was a prosecutor, and they took him at night and just various things, and they found false witnesses to go against him. Didn't allow him to speak, or he wouldn't speak, and didn't have anybody on his side speak for him. So just a bunch going on there. So we're going to pick up in chapter 27, and we're going to start with verse 7. We'd also back up one verse. We'd also pointed out that when the chief priest took the silver pieces and said, "It is not lawful for to put them into the treasury because it is the price of blood," how hypocritical that was. And also the fact that by him not accepting them, when Judas came to him and said that he had betrayed innocent blood, if they had been doing things right and justly, they would have reversed everything. But still, Caiaphas said, "What does it matter to us? You going about your business," because they had gotten what they wanted. They had gotten the sentence of death to that point. Picking up in verse 7, it says, "And the council brought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in, wherefore the field that was called the field of blood unto this day. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremy the prophet, saying, And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him that was valued, whom they of the children of Israel did value." Now, by this verse 9 being a fulfillment of prophecy, it says that it was spoken by Jeremy or Jeremiah the prophet. But if you go back to Jeremiah, it's not going to be in that book. It will be in the book of Zechariah, about 11 verse 13. So why? And because there's so many people out there that want to point out or try to point out discrepancies, why would it be that it is actually in Zechariah when it's referenced here as being in Jeremiah? And is that a cause for concern? Bingo. That is point one. It was spoken by and recorded. It was recorded by Zechariah, but spoken by Jeremiah. That is one of the good explanations. Another good explanation was that the way they referred to the books back in those days, if he had been referring to the prophets, with Jeremiah being the first prophet, he could have been speaking of the books of prophecy and not just. But I like the answer you came up with best, that it was more than likely spoken by Jeremiah, but recorded by Zechariah. Good answer. Anybody else with questions or comments? Then verse 11 says, "And gave them for the potter's field as the Lord appointed me." We'd pointed out a little irony in Sunday morning's lesson also, and now isn't there a little irony here in that Judas betrayed Christ for 30 pieces of silver. Then he tried to give the money back, and even though he had betrayed him with 30 pieces of silver, that 30 pieces of silver went to do good, because now there is a field where people, strangers, can be buried. And who does Christ take in? All strangers that will accept him. So, like I said, just my quirky way of looking at things. Verse 11, "And Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? And Jesus said unto him, Thou sayest. And when he was accused of the chief priest and the elders, he answered nothing. Then Pilate said unto him, Hearest thou not how many things they witness against thee? And he answered him to never a word. insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. Now, let's stop there for a second. Remember, as we had discussed Sunday, if there's going to be false witnesses against you, what good does it do to say anything? There was 2 false witnesses against him, and he was one man, so he was better off just keeping his mouth shut, wasn't he? My dad had a saying that he passed on to me, and I think it sort of fits here. He says, son should never argue with a fool, because the passerby is not going to be able to tell the difference. Again, if he had opened his mouth, he would have been sort of caught in the trap that they're trying to trap him in, wouldn't he? Now, verse 15, we get into, at the feast, the governor was wont to release unto the people a prisoner whom they would. Now, we don't know exactly when this tradition started, but you can be assured that even though the governor said he wanted to do it, it wasn't his idea. Governors in Rome in the first century basically had 0 authority. They had a lot of responsibility, but they had no authority. And Bobby's shaking his head because he's military. He's been where I've been a few times, where if anything goes wrong, you're responsible, but you don't have the authority to make the decisions to do anything about it. So it was either given an approval by one of the Caesars, or it wouldn't have been done. But at the feast is wont to release a prisoner. Verse 16, they had a notable prisoner called Barabbas. If we go to Mark 15 and verse 7, we know why Barabbas was a notable prisoner. If somebody would read that, Mark 15 and 7. Okay. Now, as we get into this, we're going to find out that it's Pilate's idea. Pilate comes up with, who do you want me to release, Barabbas or Jesus? Now, Barabbas had caused was party to an insurrection. Barabbas murdered. What crime had Christ committed? None. 2 people totally on the opposite ends of the scales. I'm sure that there was a whole bunch of people in between, and some that had not committed too bad a crime that he could have used instead of Barabbas. But why do you think he used Barabbas? His crimes were known, and at least to me, in my opinion, there's one thing that if I give you the option of taking the absolute worst of something or letting this man go, what would most people do? They would take the good over the terrible. So he put out the very worst person he could stand up there and say, is this the guy you want? Or do you want Jesus? But that shows you how much the people had turned, because what had happened less than a week before this? What happened when Christ was coming into Jerusalem? They were laying out palm leaves. They were praising him. And now the people 180 degrees the other way. Brother Gotts.
We see today how many people it takes for life. So, with the priest and Christ, taking all this stuff on, people fall.
Yeah. That's what they've got it set up as. Next couple of verses go together. Therefore, when they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ? For he knew that for envy they had delivered him. Pilate knew that Christ was totally innocent, and it was only because that the priests were envious of him had they plotted against him and had turned him over. And again, you take the worst and the best, and now it's going to turn it over to the people to make a choice. If we look in the book of Luke, we won't take time to turn there because we've got a lot to cover tonight if we get through it. But in the book of Luke, it spells it out a little bit more. But Pilate had actually asked them 3 times, Barabbas or Christ, hoping that they would change their mind, because as we see later, Pilate knew that he was innocent and washed his hands of the matter. Verse 19, when he was set down on the judgment seat, now I take it that he's already been sitting there or had just gotten there, because all of this starts early in the morning. His wife said unto him, have thou nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. How can she say she has suffered many things in a dream this day when it is probably breaking day? It is just getting daylight when all of this is starting to take place. Their day started 12 hours before, roughly 6 o'clock at night. So that is correct. It was her day, but it was still at night while they were sleeping, and while she was sleeping, all of this was taking place with Christ. Christ had his meal probably somewhere close to the 9 o'clock hour. By midnight, he's taken captive, and then all between midnight and 6 a.m. is the time that they're dealing with Caiaphas, and now at daybreak, they start to bring him into, at daylight, they start to bring him into Pilate for the rest of it. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said unto them, whether the twain will ye that I release unto you? And they said, Barabbas. Pilate said unto them, what shall I do with Jesus, which is called Christ? They all say unto him, let him be crucified. Notice this next thing that the governor asked. And the governor said, why? What evil hath he done? But they cried out the more, saying, let him be crucified. Now, one thing here is that Pilate had, looking back into secular history a little bit, Pilate had already been in just a little bit of difficulty with Caesar. And so he was going to be on his best behavior to try to keep things as calm as he could in the area, because if there was an insurrection, if there was an uprising in that location, who's responsible? He is, Pilate. And what would they have done with him if he allowed such? He's gone. So he wanted to try to smooth things over and let things be as mellow as they could. So he is going to, I'm going to use a fancy word, acquiesce. Anybody know what that word means? Allow, pass it over to somebody else for that. You know, he's going to give in to the Jews' demands that Christ be crucified so he can keep his position and keep things on the level. He has to pacify the mob, and he has to pacify the Caesar. So Yes, sir. Absolutely. And it's a shame they do, but they do. Verse 24 then says, when Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. Now, to me, this is a very important verse, based on, for the reasons that was just stated by Brother Jackie there, that sometimes politicians bend and do things unjust just to look out for themselves. He has been a hypocrite, because here, symbolically, he washes his hands of the matter and says, I am what? I will have nothing to do with this innocent man. But did he not have the power? So how could he wash his hands of the matter? He couldn't. It could only be symbolically. So I hold both the Jews and Pilate responsible for Christ's death. Yeah. But again, he didn't turn him over to them to see to it, because he then, by Roman standards, had him scourged. That was not the Jews that did it. It was the Romans that had him scourged. So he still participated in the act after he had said, I'm free of this innocent blood. But then released he Barnabas unto them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Now, why would he scourge him if he had called him innocent? I'm sorry? To satisfy the people. I'm not sure that I would agree totally with that, because what the people wanted was Christ's death. They wanted him crucified. It was what they were doing was treating Christ as a slave at this point. And Roman standard was that if a slave was condemned to death, the slave was scourged before he was put to death, just for a little added punishment there. Now, when we think of a scourging as just a beating or a whipping that we've seen, but it goes into a little bit more detail than that. What they would do is they had a leather whip that was only about this long, had a handle, and then had leads on it about this long. And then the ends of those was embedded either stone, gravel, or bone. And if any of you are hunters in here, you find a deer with a broken leg, you find out real quick how sharp that bone can be. But anyway, they embedded sharp bone, and then when they beat him, instead of just like a whip, they would hit and drag it across the body. So in essence, what they're doing is just cutting the flesh as from the time it bites till the time it releases. So they're just basically filleting his back. Then the Romans did not have any set number of lashes that they would give a person. They were masters at this kind of torture. They even killed a few, not meaning to, before crucifixion. But they were sort of masters at getting a person to the point of death and then stopping and reviving him so he could go on with the rest of his punishment. But that is what's taking place. And also, to increase it, instead of having him just stand up, they would tie him around a pillar or stretch them out over something and tie their hands. If you've done that, you know how tight your skin on your back gets. So that just, the tighter the skin when something goes, then that's just that much deeper and that much more that it cuts. And that was what Pilate did to Jesus, or had done to Jesus when he scourged him. And this is probably one of the reasons that Christ did not have the strength to carry his cross all the way up to the crucifixion point, because he had been up all night, been in the court with Caiaphas, and then now he is with Pilate, and now he's scourged, and now he's going to have to carry this cross. And it was not light. But then it says in verse 27, then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall and gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers. Now, when he went into the common hall, the Jews did not go into the common hall with him. This was only Pilate, or only the Romans. Again, to me, this shows, just again shows the hypocrisy of Caiaphas and the elders, because they had done everything illegal up to this point about crucifying him or getting him killed. And when they wouldn't take the money and put it in the treasury, that's hypocrisy. And now they won't go into the common hall where the Romans have taken Jesus, because they did not want to defile themselves so they could not partake of their feast meal. So all the way through, all you see is the priest and the elders of this situation. They were wrong from the start, and they wrong on the end. Questions or comments so far? Brother Golden. Yes, sir. That it does. And also there's some Psalms quotes in there too. Stripped him and put on a scarlet robe. And when they had platted a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head, and a reed in his hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. And they spit upon him. Again, that spitting on him was another fulfilled prophecy back in Isaiah. What is that, about Isaiah 50 and verse 6 or somewhere around there? Okay. So they spit on him, gave him a reed, and after that they had mocked him. They took the robe off of him and put his own raiment on him and led him away to be crucified. Verse 32, and as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. Now, if you just read this, it indicates that as soon as they come out of the hall, Simon the Cyrene carried the cross for Jesus. But if you go to John chapter 19, verses 16 and 17, John 19, 16 and 17.
Then they delivered them to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. And he bare his cross and followed to a place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha.
All right. So how do we reconcile the book of John saying that Christ carried his cross and the book of Matthew that says Simon carried his cross? Evidently he carried it part of the way, or from the time he walked out the door with it, Simon helped him with it, right? So I don't see any big cause of uproar here. Verse 35, and they crucified him and parted his garments, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet. They parted my garments among them, and upon my vesture did they cast lots, and sitting down, they watched him there, and set up over his head his accusation written, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Then were there two thieves crucified with him, one on the right hand and another on the left. And they that passed by reviled him, wagging their heads. Now, what does it mean if somebody looks at you and wags their head? Pardon? Well, a pity or a shame, it can go several different ways there, but in this case, they look at him and shake their head. Some could be having pity, and some could be, oh man. Pardon? Now, verse 40 says, and saying, now as they're wagging their heads and reviling him and all, they say, and saying, thou that destroyest the temple and buildest it in 3 days, save thyself, if thou be the Son of God, come down from the cross. Now, they were mocking him. And here, do you remember Sunday when we talked about this? Somebody go to John chapter 2 and verse 19. John 2 and 19.
Jesus answered and said unto them, destroy the temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.
So in John, it says that Christ said, destroy, meaning you destroy it and I will rebuild it. Now, when we discussed this Sunday, if you'll look at chapter 26 of Matthew and verse 61, what the two false witnesses said was, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. So what is being said in verse 40 of chapter 27 is, thou that destroyest, meaning Christ, you're going to destroy it, and you said you'd destroy it and build it. Save yourself. They're mocking him. But do you see how quickly a lie can take root? One of the, well, I don't know whether to call him the worst or the best. It depends on how you look at it. But one of the, in my opinion, one of the best propagandists in the world was in the Nazi party in Germany. And it was often said that you tell a big enough lie long enough and it will become the truth. And that's the way their propaganda machine worked in Nazi Germany, was you tell it and Goebbels. You tell it, you just keep repeating it, and people are going to start believing it. And here, the two false witnesses made the statement that this man said, and now the next day, it's been repeated by the people that are walking around and mocking Christ. Verse 42 says he saved himself, others he cannot. He saved others, himself he cannot save. If he be the King of Israel, let him come down from the cross, and we will believe him. Well, was he the King of Israel? Again, that's what they thought. He's up until the book of Acts, he's still going to build an earthly kingdom here. That's a absolute fact, and I always on that one I go back to when he went to the grave of Lazarus that had been dead 4 days, already stinking, and told him to come out of the grave. What does it say immediately thereafter? Some believed and some did not. They saw the same thing, and it definitely was a miracle, raising somebody from the dead that was already decaying, how could you not believe it? And here it's the same thing. You just don't believe it. Boom, boom, boom. Verse 44. The thieves also, which were crucified with him, cast the same in his teeth. Luke 23:39. Luke 23:39. A little clarification.
And one of the malefactors which were hanged railed on him, saying, If thou be Christ, save thyself.
Yeah,
The malefactors and malefactors.
malefactors. One.
And one of the malefactors which were hanged railed on him,
And,
saying, If thou be Christ, save thyself.
and see here in Matthew, the thieves, both of them. Well, how do you reconcile that, or do you even need to? How about if both of them just sort of started out and then one of them come to his senses? You know, it took Nebuchadnezzar 7 years for his attention to be gotten. But here, if we go to Luke, we can see where only one stayed on that and the other one was on Christ's side. Verse 45 says, From the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. So if we put that in today's terms, what is the 6th hour? I heard it. Noon. And then 9th hour would be 3. So you can sort of see the timeline here if we go back and look at it very briefly. Christ had his Last Supper, instituted that, went out into the garden to pray, betrayed. Early morning hours, he was with Caiaphas and that tribunal. Daybreak, they switched it over to Romans, Pilate. So from morning until to be crucified, noon, everything gets dark. 3 o'clock in the afternoon until 3. And the important part is, before the day is over, before the next day starts at sundown, they've got to have him off the cross because of Jewish religion. They can't touch dead stuff on that next day. So all of that has to take place that quickly. Verse 47, some of them that stood by when they heard that, where'd they go? Okay. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, and I'm not going to try to pronounce those words, but it just says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And if we go back into Psalms 22 and verse 1, that's where that saying comes from. But then some of them that stood there, when they heard that, said, this man calleth for Elias. Why do you think that they would say you call for Elias? Pardon? Okay. But to those that were on the cusp of believing, I guess you could say, those that were sort of hanging in the middle, not really dedicated this way or that, they believed that, and it was even stated in the New Testament, that Elias had to come back before the Messiah. Well, who was Elias? Elias was John the Baptist. So Christ was already back, but those that, like I say, those that were sort of in the middle, betwixt and between, that didn't understand fully, they thought that he was calling for the one that was coming back to precede the Messiah. Because to this day, the Jews do not believe that the Messiah has returned. Verse 48 then, and straightway one of them ran, took a sponge, filled it with vinegar, and put it on a reed, and gave him to drink. Basically, this is just sour wine with trying to give him something to drink. And the rest said, let us see whether Elias will come to save him. And Jesus, when he had cried out again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost, meaning he died. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent. I have not been to that area of the world. I used to want to go, but with the way the world situation is today, I want to stay in Alabama. But for those that have visited, they say that there is still indications where that there had been an event similar to an earthquake where the rocks were split apart, and they're still split apart today. But also the veil being rent in twain from top to bottom. This to me also indicates that it was something from God tearing it from the top down instead of people grabbing it and tearing it from the bottom up. If people had been involved, that's the way it would have been torn. But here it specifically from the top down. And in verse 52 and 53, it says, the graves were open, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose and came out of the graves after his resurrection and went into the holy city, meaning Jerusalem, and appeared unto many. Not even going to try to get into this because we don't have near about enough time, but there's a lot of people want to bring up a lot of different things here, but when it comes right down to it, we don't know what happened to those people. We know that Christ was the first born of the resurrection. He is the one that died and rose to live and never die again. And these come out of the grave after his resurrection. So there's no way they're going to stick these people in front of his resurrection if they just read it and understand it. But I find verse 54 also very, very intriguing. When the centurion, now what is a centurion? Roman officer over how many people? Over 100. How do you get to be a centurion? You work your way up through the ranks. Who do they put in charge of 100 people? The best. Not necessarily the meanest, but those that can get the job done, whether they need to be mean or not, right? So when it's talking about a centurion here, it's not talking about somebody uneducated and down here just in the weeds. They're talking about somebody with some knowledge and got it all together, and power. And they that were with him, the centurion, and they that were with him, watching Jesus, saw the earthquake and those things that were done. They feared greatly, saying, truly, this was the Son of God. You don't have one of Jesus' disciples or one of Jesus' apostles or his mother or Mary Magdalene that was so close to him. You don't have any of those making the statement. You have a Roman centurion that was in charge. He was probably the one in charge of his crucifixion too, but taking him out that way. But he is the one that now says, truly, this was the Son of God. And many of the women were there beholding afar off, which followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering unto him. The women that had, well, I guess we'll pick up here Sunday morning. Thank y'all so much for your attention and your comments. Yes, sir.
These false witnesses said that Jesus would destroy him. That wasn't the way he did.
Nope. He said, you destroy it and I'll rebuild it. But thanks again.
Good evening. It's time for us to begin. Good evening. If you'd like to mark the song of invitation, it'll be 9:47. 9:47. Once you have that marked, if you turn to 414. Four, 414. First and fourth verse only. If you have it, let us sing. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere he leads me in this world below. Anywhere without him, dearest joy would fade. Anywhere with Jesus I am not afraid. Anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus I can go to sleep. When the darkening shadows round about me creep, knowing I shall waken nevermore to roam. Anywhere with Jesus will be home, sweet home. Anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go.
Guess I'm gonna have to start using the stairs all the time. Good evening. I have a short invitation for you tonight, and it's going to start out with a very simple question. How is your heart? Now, as we grow older, many of us develop physical impairments. Hearing goes, eyesight goes, various things like that go. But there is an impairment that is worse than physical impairment, and that is spiritual impairment. When Jesus had spoken one of his parables in Matthew, his disciples questioned him. If you'll turn to Matthew chapter 13, in verse 10, they said, and the disciples came and said unto him, why speakest thou unto them in parables? He then answers that question in verses 11 through 15, but verse 15 to me is the key verse. For this people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and should understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. See, Jesus said those folks' ears were dull of hearing, and they'd closed their eyes, but for what reason? And that was that their heart had waxed gross. When we're talking about spiritual matters, the heart is always the start of issues. Now, sometimes our physical impairments, if we lose our eyesight or our hearing to a degree, it could cause us to have an accident. It could even cause us to have an accident that would cause our death. But did you know that spiritual impairment will definitely cause spiritual death unless it is corrected in time? Those in Matthew 13 through 15 that we talked about, they would not respond to Jesus because of their heart. One of my favorite passages in the Bible is Ezra 7 and verse 10. For Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord and to do it, and to teach in Israel statutes and judgment. When our heart is prepared as Ezra, when we are looking to find the law of Christ and do it, then we can call upon the Lord to be saved. If you go to Romans 10, verses 13 and 14, for whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? It all starts with the heart. So again, I ask the question, how is your heart? Is it ready to see, to hear, to believe, to understand, and to accept the Word of God? If you've never become a Christian, you hear, you believe, you repent, you confess, you be baptized, and if you are a Christian and have made a mistake, you confess your faults one to another and pray one for another. If there's any need, please come while we stand and sing at this time.
Calling today, watch from the sunshine of love will thou roam, farther and farther away. Calling today, calling today. Jesus is calling, is tenderly calling today. Jesus is pleading, oh, listen to his voice. Hear him today, hear him today. They who believe in his name shall rejoice. Quickly arise and obey. Calling today, calling today. Jesus is calling, is tenderly calling today. You may be seated.
We have a busy week with all the sick folks, especially tomorrow. I'll go try to not miss anybody on the sick list. But starting with tomorrow, Kevin Moody is having cataract surgery. Brother Terry is having a bronchoscopy. I have to stop and pause to get that word right every time. But they're going to go down, take a look in his lungs and biopsy, I think, also, and see if they can't find some way to come up with a treatment for him. For those that have not heard, he has got a real bad, I don't guess there's anything as a good case, but he's got a real severe case of double pneumonia. So Holly is going in for her back surgery tomorrow, and that's going to be a pretty extensive back surgery. Andrea has a appointment with a specialist. Been waiting on it for about 10 weeks. I think that's all the events that take place tomorrow. But then in addition to that, Kay's home sick. Brother Charles is still on oxygen on the big bottles now. His little bag won't do any good. Is Priscilla still in pain, or is she? Okay, Priscilla still has not gotten rid of that kidney stone. And mentioning that, Brother Kevin Moody, in addition to cataract surgery, is also trying to nurse one or pass one, so kidney stone. And Rick May is home, is dealing with the diabetes. They about got that adjusted, right? I assume, okay. And that's Harvey. Brother Harvey Cox has got a kidney stone, and they're going to do in and vaporize it, hopefully. Brother Glenn Fuller is still recovering from his heart procedure. He's at home. Sister Dot, really, really weak from her last chemo treatment. When we talked to her last, she said it'd probably be 4 to 6 months before she was even close back to normal. I believe that's got all the sick folks in. Is there anything else we need to know at this time? If you would be standing, and Brother Kirk Mayfield will have our closing prayer.
Dear Father, again we come, give thanks for this middle of the week we've had gathered together to study another portion of our word and strengthen our. Dear Father, we come at this time and ask